Imagine a modern superpower deploying its military across foreign borders.
Right.
And they aren't doing it for, ideological reasons. They aren't trying to spread their form of government or win over the hearts and minds of the local populace.
Yeah, it's not a hearts and minds campaign at all.
Exactly. They are doing it for one very specific, entirely pragmatic reason. They need to secure a critical supply chain of raw materials that they completely lack at home.
Yes.
Now, if you read that in an article this morning, you probably assume it was about lithium or oil or rare earth metals. I mean, it's basically the playbook of modern geopolitics.
It absolutely is.
But what if I told you that this exact strategic doctrine, like the literal military subjugation of a foreign territory just to extract natural resources, was etched into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago?
It's one of those things that forces us to completely reevaluate our concept of ancient history. We have this, this tendency to view the ancient past through a lens of mythology.
Right. Gods and magic.
Exactly. Primitive superstition, completely disconnected from the brutal calculus of our modern world. But the fundamental drivers of human civilization, right? Things like resource scarcity, the logistical nightmare of managing massive urban populations.
And the exploitation of labor?
Yes, the exploitation of labor and the projection of military power. Those haven't changed at all. I mean, the technology has evolved, obviously, but the underlying mechanisms of statecraft, they are identical.
Which is exactly why we are taking a massive stack of sources today. We're talking archaeological records, socioeconomic data, and some really rigorous academic analyses. And we are pointing them directly at a text you probably thought you knew.
The Epic of Gilgamesh.
The Epic of Gilgamesh. But to be clear, the mission of this deep dive today is not to recount some fantasy about a king wrestling divine bulls or, searching for magic plants.
No, we're throwing out the mythical reading entirely.
Entirely. Instead, we are analyzing Gilgamesh strictly through a geopolitical, socioeconomic, and historical lens. We're looking at this ancient poem as a literal blueprint for early statecraft. It is a record of the struggle for regional hegemony and, honestly, a terrifyingly clear-eyed account of the high human cost required to build the first civilizations.
And to do that effectively, we have to lean really heavily on the academic rigor of the scholars who have, spent lifetimes translating and contextualizing these shattered fragments.
Because it's not easy work.
It's grueling. The academic framework for our discussion rests on what scholars actually call the work on the myth. To understand it, we kind of have to go back to George Smith's earth-shattering discovery in, I believe it was December 1872.
Yes, 1872.
Right. So Smith was this brilliant, self-taught British Assyriologist. He was working at the British Museum, and he was translating a fragment of a clay tablet that had been pulled from the ruins of King Ashurbanibal's library in Nineveh.
Which is in modern-day Iraq, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that specific tablet contained the story of Utanapishti. He is essentially the Babylonian Noah. The text detailed his survival of this catastrophic, world-ending flood.
Hold on, I really want to pause on George Smith for a second here, because that discovery wasn't just, a quiet academic achievement in some dusty back room. It was a cultural earthquake.
Oh, absolutely.
He essentially found a Mesopotamian flood narrative that completely predated the biblical account in Genesis. But how much of what Smith found back then was an accurate historical reflection and how much of it was just like Victorian-era projection?
Yeah.
Because the translation process must have been in its absolute infancy.
He was absolutely in its infancy. And you're completely right to question those initial interpretations.
Right.
I mean, Smith was brilliant, but we have to remember he was working with shattered fragments of clay, translating a totally dead language, and doing so within the highly politicized, religiously charged environment of 19th century Britain.
Right. There was a lot of baggage there.
No, tons of baggage. That's why our understanding today doesn't just rely on Smith's initial passes. It relies on modern, exhaustive, philological reconstructions by researchers like A.R. George.
His work is incredible.
It really is. A.R. George basically compiled a critical edition of the epic by cross-referencing, over 100 different text witnesses, literally fragments scattered in museums across the globe. He systematically stripped away the Victorian Romanticism to give us the raw, accurate text.
And to understand the world that produced that raw text, we are pairing George's translation with the socioeconomic data compiled by historians like Paul Cooper and the really deep textual analyses of scholars like Stefan Moll.
Exactly. That combination of philology and economic data is where the real story is.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we use that modern data to strip away the gods, the monsters, and the whole two-thirds divine hero trope, What did the actual historical Mesopotamian landscape actually look like when the historical figure of Gilgamesh was, actually walking around?
Well, we have to transport ourselves to southern Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE. Historians formally classify this as the Uruk period. And the geography itself dictates everything that follows.
How so?
So this is the alluvial plain, situated right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It is incredibly fertile if you manage it correctly, but it is also a remarkably demanding, completely hostile environment.
Right.
Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh presents the city of Uruk as this divinely ordained jewel of grandeur, right? A city blessed and protected by the gods. The mythological thesis is basically that Uruk is great because the heavens will it to be great.
But the data from Paul Cooper tells a vastly different story. The economic antithesis to that divine blessing idea is just staggering. We aren't talking about a sprawling village of mud brick huts by the river here. Uruk was the world's first true megacity.
The scale is what most people really fail to grasp. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, which is a time when the earliest Egyptian pyramids were still hundreds of years in the future. Yeah, and Stonehenge wasn't even a concept yet. During that time, Uruk and its immediate metropolitan orbit had swelled to an estimated population of up to 90,000 inhabitants.
90,000 people.
90,000. The urban core alone covered 2.5 square kilometers. If you adjust for the global population at the time, Uruk was essentially the equivalent of New York, London, and Tokyo rolled into a single dominant hub.
But wait, feeding 90,000 people without mechanized agriculture, without, refrigeration or trains or trucks, the logistics of that just completely boggle the mind. How do you even track the caloric intake required to keep an urban center of that size from starving to death in a single week?
You invent a completely new technology. You invent writing.
Yeah.
Samuel Noah Kramer, who is this legendary Sumerologist, famously compiled a list of 39 firsts in human civilization that originated in Sumer. And arguably the most consequential of those was cuneiform.
But the mechanism behind the invention of writing is the crucial part here. They didn't invent cuneiform because early humans suddenly felt this deep urge to write down poetry or record philosophical musings.
Right, absolutely not.
They invented it out of sheer, terrifying administrative necessity.
Precisely. It was an accounting technology, period. When you have 90,000 people concentrated in one area, you are dealing with a massive agricultural surplus generated by the surrounding rural farmland.
Because everyone in the city isn't farming.
Exactly. That surplus has to be physically collected, stored in centralized temple granaries, protected from rot and rats, and then redistributed to all those specialized workers in the city who don't grow their own food. The earliest cuneiform tablets we have aren't literature at all. They are basically ancient Excel spreadsheets.
I love that comparison. Ancient spreadsheets.
It's exactly what they were. They track how many bushels of barley went to a specific temple or how many sheep were traded by a specific merchant. Writing was born strictly as a tool for state-level logistics.
And once you have state-level logistics, you can have specialized labor, which leads us directly to mass production. This is the part of the socioeconomic data that absolutely blew my mind when I was reading through our sources.
Pottery, right?
Yes, the pottery. If you look at the pottery from the period right before Uruk, which is the Ubaid period, the artifacts are beautiful. They are hand-painted. They feature these really intricate geometric designs, carefully crafted on a slow-turning wheel. They were luxury goods crafted by true artisans.
Yes.
But then, as Uruk just explodes in population, the archaeological record shows the quality of the pottery falling off an absolute cliff. It becomes ugly, it's crude, and it's purely functional. Why? Because they invented the fast wheel.
The transition from the slow wheel to the fast wheel is so telling. It is one of the first documented instances in human history of technological advancement driving artistic degradation in favor of sheer volume.
It's the ancient equivalent of the Industrial Revolution disrupting artisan guilds, or Henry Ford's assembly line. You don't get a bespoke, handcrafted product anymore. You get a crude, identical clay bowl.
Right.
But the mechanism is what matters. A skilled artisan taking hours to paint a single pot cannot support an economy of 90,000 people. The fast wheel allowed a single, semi-skilled laborer to churn out hundreds of identical beveled rim bowls in a single day. The quality dropped, but the volume skyrocketed. It allowed for the first true consumer economy.
And that industrial scaling extended way beyond just pottery. The textile industry is perhaps the most brutal example we have.
Oh, yeah.
We have surviving administrative records from the neighboring Sumerian city of Girsu that meticulously detail their state-run textile operations. They employed roughly 15,000 women specifically for weaving.
15,000.
Yes. And Paul Cooper actually highlights records of a single temple factory complex that was producing 1,100 tons of flour per year. 1,100 tons, alongside massive industrial outputs of beer, bread, and linseed oil.
But let's look at the human element of those 1,100 tons of flour. These weren't, citizens clocking in for a 9-to-5 job and going home with a paycheck, because currency, like minted money, didn't exist yet. So how were these 15,000 women in the textile mills actually being compensated?
They were compensated through a highly managed, heavily stratified command economy that was based entirely on state-issued rations.
Rations.
Yes. The records detail a factory employing 858 specialized workers, mostly women, and their payment was mathematically tied to their perceived value to the state. The baseline ration for an unskilled laborer was approximately 20 liters of barley per month.
Just 20 liters?
20 liters, supplemented by a meager yearly allowance of wool for clothing and a tiny amount of oil.
20 liters of raw barley a month. I mean, that is a starvation wage. You are essentially working just to consume enough calories to survive to work the next day.
Exactly.
But here's where I really need you to clarify something for me. Because if Uruk had this incredibly complex, highly centralized command economy, complete with massive agricultural surplus, specialized labor forces, and intense bureaucratic oversight via cuneiform spreadsheets, why did they end up ruled by an autocratic tyrant like Gilgamesh?
It's a great question.
Right, because if the administration is that advanced, why didn't a wealthy oligarchy or a board of directors or even a basic representative assembly maintain control? Why give it all to one guy?
So the theory proposed by the prominent Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen argues that they actually did begin with a form of representative governance.
Really?
Yes. Jacobsen coined the term primitive democracy to describe early Mesopotamian political structures.
Yeah.
Before the era of kings, these cities were governed by assemblies. You basically had a bicameral system. First, the city fathers, who were the elders and wealthy landowners dictating policy.
Okay.
And then the young men, the able-bodied citizens who actually executed those decisions, handled the physical labor, and formed the city's militia.
Okay, I have to push back on the term democracy there. Calling a group of wealthy, land-owning elders a democracy in 3000 BCE feels like a massive modern projection. Weren't these city fathers just an oligarchy trying to protect their own grain silos?
That's a highly valid critique, actually. And many modern scholars agree that oligarchy is definitely a more accurate term than democracy for that structure. But the crucial mechanism to understand is that power was distributed among a group rather than centralized in one individual.
Right, okay.
Decisions required consensus. And that reliance on consensus is exactly what led to their downfall. As Uruk swelled to 90,000 people, the sheer complexity of managing the city outpaced the assembly's ability to govern it. When you rely on a slow-moving assembly of elders debating over agricultural policy, you are highly vulnerable to sudden crises. And in Mesopotamia, crises were constant.
What kind of crises?
A sudden shift in the Euphrates could wipe out an entire harvest, or a neighboring city-state could launch a raid.
Right. When a hostile army is literally marching on your walls, you cannot wait 3 weeks for a council of wealthy elders to vote on a military budget.
No, you can't.
You need an executive. You need a single individual who can bypass the bureaucracy and issue immediate binding orders.
Exactly. In times of existential threat, these assemblies would reluctantly vote to temporarily surrender their authority. They would grant emergency dictatorial powers to a singular military leader. In Sumerian, this figure was designated the Lugal, which translates literally to big man.
The big man.
Yes. The Lugal was a secular strongman, chosen specifically for his capacity to wage war and enforce order.
And, as history has shown us time and time again, once a strongman is handed emergency dictatorial powers, they very rarely give them back.
Never. That is the historical pivot. Over generations, these temporary emergency powers solidified into permanent dynastic rule. The Lugal systematically usurped the authority of the assemblies, transferring power from the temple and the elders directly to the palace. The historical figure of Gilgamesh represents the absolute culmination of this transition.
Wow. He embodies the shift from a fragmented theocratic oligarchy to a completely centralized, secular, and dictatorial military hegemony.
Which perfectly transitions us to the external pressures that justified the Lugal in the first place. Because Gilgamesh didn't just need to manage the domestic economy of Uruk, he had to ensure its survival on the regional stage. Uruk was a megacity, sure, but it wasn't operating in a vacuum. It had rivals.
Major rivals.
Which brings us to the geopolitical struggle between Uruk and the northern city of Kish.
Right. The Epic of Gilgamesh, like most ancient mythologies, has a habit of framing major geopolitical conflicts as these sort of petty, localized squabbles between arrogant kings. Usually they're arguing over who is the most favored by the gods.
It's very personalized.
It is. The mythologized version abstracts the very real, very bloody political reality.
But the historical reality is a gritty, high-stakes conflict over regional dominance. The sources point us to a specific Sumerian poem called Gilgamesh and Aga. It doesn't get the same mainstream attention as the main epic, but structurally, it is absolutely vital. It really is the key to understanding the geopolitics.
Aga is the king of Kish, which is a powerful city situated to the north of Uruk. And at this point in history, Kish holds the traditional regional hegemony. They are the established superpower, and Uruk is the rising economic threat.
And King Aga recognizes that threat perfectly. He decides to flex Kish's superpower status to put Uruk in its place. Aga sends envoys down the river to Uruk with a non-negotiable demand. He says the citizens of Uruk must submit to forced labor, specifically corvée labor, to dig wells for the city of Kish.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of that demand, because digging wells sounds like, I don't know, a minor civic project. But in the context of southern Mesopotamia, weaponizing water infrastructure is a massive escalation, isn't it?
It's the ultimate escalation. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were notoriously unpredictable. They didn't flood gently like the Nile did. They flooded violently, completely washing away crops. Or even worse, they would change their course entirely, leaving massive urban centers stranded in the desert to literally turn to dust.
So water is everything.
If you control the water infrastructure, the irrigation canals, the reservoirs, the deep wells, you possess the ultimate geopolitical leverage. Controlling water in ancient Sumer was the direct equivalent of controlling the global oil supply today.
That's a great way to put it. So Aga's demand for Uruk to dig wells in Kish wasn't just about scoring some free physical labor.
Not at all. It was a calculated strategic maneuver designed to publicly subordinate Uruk. By forcing Uruk to divert its own manpower and economic resources to build Kish's vital infrastructure, Aga is demanding a very public display of vassalage.
It's the ancient version of a proxy war, or, an empire imposing crippling tariffs on a satellite state just to prove that they can.
Right.
It's a direct test of Uruk's sovereignty. If Uruk agrees to dig the wells, they formally acknowledge they are a vassal state to Kish.
Yes.
If they refuse, it's an act of open rebellion. It means war.
And this specific crisis is where we see the remnants of Jacobson's primitive democracy operate one final time. Because Gilgamesh, despite being the Lugal, doesn't unilaterally declare war on Kish right away.
He still has to play the political game.
He goes through the motions of consulting the assemblies. The text of Gilgamesh and Aga details how he first approaches the city fathers, the elders. He proposes rebellion, saying, essentially, let us not submit to the house of Kish, let us smite them with weapons.
But the elders are inherently conservative.
Right, exactly. They possess the wealth, the land, the trade contracts. A war with the regional superpower threatens their bottom line. So they vote for appeasement. They officially advise Gilgamesh to submit to Aga's demands.
But Gilgamesh, acting as the military executive, effectively vetoes the elders. He completely rejects their appeasement and takes his proposal straight to the young men, the fighting force.
And the young men who possess far less material wealth and stand to gain social mobility and glory through military conquest, they eagerly vote for war. They officially declare Gilgamesh their supreme commander. Uruk rebels against the hegemony of Kish.
And the archaeological and historical records confirm that Uruk actually wins.
Yes, Aga is defeated. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. It marks a verified historical shift in regional power. The geopolitical center of gravity in Mesopotamia moves permanently from the north, in Kish, down to the south, in Uruk.
The ideological framework the Sumerians used to justify this endless warfare is so fascinating and honestly incredibly dangerous. The academic sources cite the Sumerian king list, which is sometimes referred to as the Blundell prism. It's a four-sided clay artifact that records the succession of Sumerian rulers. But it isn't just a history book, is it?
No, it is highly ideological.
Right. It promotes a very specific, deeply ingrained ideology. The concept that kingship descended from heaven, and crucially, the gods dictated that kingship could only reside in one city at a time.
That ideological mechanism is the engine of all ancient geopolitics in the region. By establishing that legitimate kingship can only exist in a single city, the Sumerian political system was locked into a perpetual zero-sum game. There was absolutely no conceptual framework for a balance of power or, a coalition of equals.
So if Uruk is to rise to divine favor, Kish absolutely must fall.
Exactly. The theological doctrine demanded a single, absolute hegemon.
Which is a perfect recipe for endless, brutal conflict. And to sustain endless military campaigns and to fortify your city against the inevitable retaliation from rival powers, you need an astronomical amount of resources and human labor. This brings us to the really dark socioeconomic reality of Gilgamesh's reign. The synthesis of Uruk's light is its overwhelming shadow.
Right. The shadow of civilization, the monumental architecture that defines ancient Sumer, the massive ziggurats reaching into the sky, the sprawling temple complexes, the impregnable city walls. None of it was built by willing volunteers. It was built entirely on the broken backs of forced labor.
The mythologized version of the epic really sanitizes this tyranny, doesn't it? It presents Gilgamesh as a two-thirds god whose divine, boundless physical energy simply exhausts his citizens. Like, he forces the young men to play grueling sports all day and no one can match his stamina. It frames his oppression almost as a quirk or a side effect of his heroism.
But if we strip away the myth and apply this socioeconomic lens, the shadow of Uruk's golden age is horrific. Gilgamesh is subjecting his own citizens to the exact same trauma he went to war to prevent.
Wow.
He refused to let Uruk perform corvée labor for Kish, only to turn around and enforce brutal corvée labor on his own people. He drafts the citizens of Uruk to construct a massive 9-kilometer-long perimeter wall around the city.
And we really have to consider the mechanics of building a 9-kilometer wall in Mesopotamia, because they weren't just piling up mud. The epic boasts that the wall was constructed of kiln-fired bricks.
Yes.
Sun-dried mud bricks are cheap and they're easy to make, but they dissolve in heavy rain. Kiln-fired bricks are virtually indestructible, but they require a massive amount of fuel to bake. In a landscape that is famously scarce of timber, gathering the fuel, firing millions of bricks, and hauling them into place requires a terrifying mobilization of forced human capital. Gilgamesh effectively enslaved his own populace to build his state monuments.
And the tyranny wasn't just physical exhaustion. It involved profound psychological and bodily violation. The text specifically highlights Gilgamesh exercising droit de seigneur.
The Lord's right.
Right, the Lord's supposed right to sleep with newlywed brides on their wedding night before their husbands. Whether you interpret that literally or as a powerful metaphor for the absolute extraction of a population's reproductive and social future, it represents a ruler who views his subjects merely as raw material.
It is the ultimate manifestation of unchecked autocratic power. He controls their labor by day, and he violates their most intimate domestic bonds by night. And it's critical to understand that this suffering wasn't distributed equally. Early Mesopotamian society was rigidly stratified.
Very much so.
If we look at the contemporary legal codes and social structures, the population was divided into 3 distinct tiers. At the top were the awaladim. These were the elite free citizens. The priests, the wealthy merchants, the major landowners.
Then you have the middle tier, the mushonim, which from an economic standpoint is a fascinating legal status.
Yes,
The mushonim were semi-free subordinates. They were not legally considered property, so they couldn't be bought or sold like cattle, but they were permanently legally tethered to the land they worked, or to the estate of an Awila master. They owned no property of their own, and relied entirely on the state or their patron for rations. If the land was sold, the mushonim went with it.
So functionally, it's very similar to the mechanism of medieval serfdom centuries later.
Exactly the same mechanism. And at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy were the amatum, the slaves. These were individuals who were legally recognized as property. They were often citizens who had fallen into inescapable debt and were forced to sell themselves or their children to creditors. Or they were prisoners of war, captured in the endless zero-sum conflicts between the city-states.
So the shining jewel of Uruk is actually an engine powered by the absolute misery of the Mushunim and the Amatim. And eventually, the pressure cooker explodes. The people of Uruk cry out to the gods for relief from Gilgamesh's tyranny. But the gods don't send a plague, they don't strike him with lightning, they invent a much more sophisticated political mechanism to solve the problem.
They create Enkidu.
Yes.
The creation of Enkidu is a brilliant socio-political counterweight. The gods recognize that Gilgamesh's power is absolute within the urban environment. To check that power, they don't destroy him. They introduce his equal, a mirror image born entirely outside the bounds of the state.
It is the ultimate clash of dichotomies. Uruk represents civilization. It features advanced logistics, monumental architecture, and specialized labor, but it is deeply corrupt, oppressive, and structurally violent. Outside the 9-kilometer wall is the wilderness. It is pure, it is natural, but it lacks structure. It is savage. Enkidu is the avatar of the periphery. He is born in the wild, covered in hair, living peacefully among the animals.
But we have to look at how Enkidu actually behaves in the wild before he meets Gilgamesh. He doesn't just exist peacefully. He actively sabotages the rural economy.
Right.
Enkidu begins destroying the traps and filling in the pits dug by human hunters. From Enkidu's perspective, he is acting righteously. The animals are his family, and he's protecting them from predators.
But let's look at the mechanism of survival for those rural human hunters. If you are a trapper living on the periphery of Uruk, you don't have access to the temple's grain surplus. Your family's caloric survival depends entirely on the marginal yields of your traps. When Enkidu destroys those traps, he isn't just being a nuisance. He is causing mass starvation.
That is a phenomenal observation. Enkidu functions as an environmental protector for the animals, but to the rural human population, he is effectively an economic terrorist. He's collapsing the food supply of the periphery. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh is an economic engine for the urban core, but he is a domestic terrorist to his own citizens, working them to death.
So when Enkidu is finally lured into the city and the two of them clash in the streets of Uruk, it isn't just a wrestling match between two strong guys. It is the violent, localized collision of the rural crisis and the urban crisis. The untamed periphery literally wrestles with the autocratic core. They fight each other to a standstill, realizing they are equally matched, and in doing so, they form a bond. They become allies.
The energy that was threatening to tear Uruk apart from the inside and the energy that was starving the hunters on the outside is suddenly unified. The tension is completely resolved.
But you cannot contain the unified energy of two demigods within a 9-kilometer wall. Gilgamesh and Enkidu get bored. They look outward. And this leads us to the most famous and frankly the most deeply misunderstood expedition in all of ancient history, the journey to the Cedar Forest.
If you read the myth without the historical context, it reads as a standard hero's journey. Two brave warriors embark on a noble quest to slay a terrifying fire-breathing monster named Humbaba in order to win eternal fame and establish their legacy.
And this is where we have to vehemently push back on the mythological narrative and look strictly at the supply chain logistics. Because the economic incentive for this expedition becomes glaringly obvious the moment you look at a topographical map of the region. Southern Mesopotamia has an infinite supply of mud and an infinite supply of reeds. But you know what it completely lacks?
It has absolutely zero high-quality timber. It has no structural stone and no workable metal ores.
Zero. If you are the Lugal of the greatest Megacity on Earth and you want to build a magnificent new roof spanning a massive temple to the gods, or if you need to construct towering, impenetrable wooden doors for your city gates to keep out the armies of Kish, you cannot build them out of dried mud and river reeds. You need massive, straight, durable logs. You need cedar.
And the academic research by Stefan Moll and Paul Cooper really emphasizes this stark logistical reality. The journey to the Cedar Forest, which historians generally locate either in modern-day Lebanon or the Amanus Mountains in southern Turkey, was not a boyish adventure for glory. It was a highly calculated, heavily armed, strategic state mission designed to secure critical natural resources.
It is, by definition, an imperial logging expedition.
It is the projection of state power to extract foreign wealth. And recognizing that fact forces us to completely reevaluate the so-called monster of the story, Humbaba. Humbaba is not a demon crawling out of the underworld to plague humanity. According to the text itself, the gods, specifically the high god Enlil, appointed Humbaba to be the guardian of the forest. He is the indigenous protector of a resource-rich periphery.
We have to analyze this encounter through the lens of cultural hegemony. The historical sources and analyses point out that the slaying of Humbaba and the subsequent clear-cutting of the sacred cedars represents arguably the first recorded act of imperial colonization and environmental extraction.
The mechanism of the conquest is brutal. Gilgamesh and Enkidu march hundreds of miles. They corner the native guardian who is simply executing his divine mandate to protect his homeland. They murder him. They systematically chop down the ancient towering cedars, and they float the stolen timber down the Euphrates River back to the urban center of Uruk.
It's important to clarify here that our goal isn't to impose modern moral or political judgments on a 4,000-year-old text.
Right.
We are objectively analyzing how the text itself describes the mechanics of imperialism and the subjugation of native populations. Humbaba is native to the forest, just as Enkidu was once native to the wild. The scholar Hayden White writes extensively about how emerging empires use myth-making as a tool to justify violence.
Yes, myth-making is crucial.
The Epic of Gilgamesh purposefully transforms Humbaba into a terrifying, fire-breathing ogre. Why? Because if Humbaba is a monster, then Gilgamesh's violent extraction of wealth from the margins to the center can be framed as a heroic victory of good over evil, rather than a brutal, unprovoked resource grab.
It is the foundational blueprint for imperial propaganda. Demonize the native population to legitimize the violent appropriation of their land and resources. It is the victory of culture over nature, the subjugation of the wild periphery to feed the insatiable appetite of the urban core. But, the text is sophisticated enough to acknowledge that arrogantly interfering with the divine order of nature carries a massive cost.
The gods do not let the murder of their forest guardians slide.
No, I don't.
The violent conquest of the Cedar Forest, followed by their subsequent slaughter of the Bull of Heaven, triggers massive divine retribution. The gods convene and rule that the cosmic scales must be balanced. One of the heroes must die, and the death sentence falls on Enkidu.
Enkidu's death serves as the devastating catalyst for the final philosophical act of the epic. Gilgamesh, the untouchable autocrat, is forced to watch his equal, his literal mirror image, waste away and die of an inglorious illness.
It's not a glorious death in battle.
Not at all. The text is incredibly graphic about the physical reality of Enkidu's decay, detailing how Gilgamesh watches until a worm literally falls from his friend's nose.
That visceral encounter with biological decay sparks a complete psychological collapse in Gilgamesh. He realizes for the first time that he is not immune. He is going to die.
The myth depicts him tearing off his royal garments, donning raw animal skins, and wandering the perilous fringes of the earth in a desperate, maddened search for Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood.
Hoping to learn the secret of eternal youth.
Exactly. He eventually finds a magical plant of rejuvenation at the bottom of the sea, only to have it casually stolen by a passing snake while he bathes.
But again, let's strip away the mythological narrative of magic plants and sneaky reptiles. What is the actual geopolitics of mortality occurring in this sequence? What happens to a state when its supreme leader completely loses his mind?
The geopolitical reality is that Gilgamesh's breakdown exposes the terrifying fragility of autocratic power. When you dismantle the assemblies and consolidate all economic, military, and administrative power into the hands of a single Lugal, the entire state apparatus becomes intrinsically tied to that one man's biology.
Right.
When the dictator realizes he is going to die, he falls into an existential panic. Gilgamesh abandons his city. He abandons his administrative duties. Uruk is left utterly vulnerable because the linchpin of his command economy has vanished into the wilderness to chase ghosts.
And when he finally crosses the waters of death and locates Utnapishtim, he doesn't receive a magical cure or a warm embrace. The sources highlight Utnapishtim's reaction as a ruthless, highly sophisticated critique of autocratic governance.
It is a masterclass in ancient political philosophy. Utnapishtim looks at this haggard, dirt-covered king dressed in animal skins and essentially interrogates him. He asks, "What are you doing? Why are you wandering the wasteland chasing personal immortality while your city rots in your absence?" Utnapishtim reminds Gilgamesh that the function of a king is not to live forever.
It's not about the king at all.
No. The sole duty of a king is to maintain the geopolitical, economic, and social order.
He explicitly tells Gilgamesh that a ruler's job is to ensure the temple granaries are full, to manage the complex water infrastructure we talked about earlier, to oversee the specialized labor, and to protect the citizens from the very chaos Gilgamesh is currently wandering through.
Utnapishtim explains the theological boundaries of power. The gods reserve eternal life exclusively for themselves, and they specifically assign death to humanity. But to counterbalance mortality, the gods gave kings the immense responsibility of organizing the living. A ruler does not achieve his ultimate purpose by escaping his own biological death. He achieves it by organizing the terrifying chaos of the natural world into a functional, resilient, thriving society.
So we arrive at the synthesis. Gilgamesh fails the tests of sleep, he loses the magic plant to the snake, and he returns to Uruk completely empty-handed. But he doesn't return as a defeated man. The final verses of the epic show him arriving back at his city, walking up to the massive 9-kilometer perimeter wall. He turns to his boatman, Urshanabi, and commands him to climb the wall, to inspect the deep foundations, to admire the sheer scale of the kiln-fired brickwork. Why does the epic end there?
Because Gilgamesh has finally grasped the true mechanism of immortality for a ruler. It isn't biological, it is historical. True immortality is achieved through historical hegemony, monumental architecture, and statecraft.
He realizes his legacy isn't his body.
Exactly. He recognizes that his physical body will die, but the administrative and architectural systems he forced into existence will outlast him. He built a wall that will protect generations. But more crucially than the physical wall, the text tells us he took a lapis lazuli tablet and he wrote down the story of his deeds.
And that is the ultimate technological pivot. The written word, Cuneiform, which we established was invented purely as an administrative tool to count bushels of barley and track sheep, has now been completely repurposed. Gilgamesh transforms the spreadsheet into the ultimate tool for political propaganda and eternal legacy.
And the historical record proves that his strategy worked flawlessly. Centuries after the historical Gilgamesh died, a brilliant Babylonian scholar and scribe named Sinleki-Unini took the various fragmented Sumerian poems circulating about the king and compiled them into the unified, masterful Akkadian epic we read today. He didn't do this just for literary preservation.
He did it for political legitimacy.
Precisely. Later Mesopotamian emperors, giants of history like Hammurabi of Babylon and Sargon of Akkad, actively utilized the Epic of Gilgamesh as a foundational document for their own political legitimacy. They publicly claimed divine descent from Gilgamesh. They weaponized his story to justify the expansion of their own empires. Gilgamesh survived not because he found a magic plant at the bottom of the sea, but because he understood that if you control the geopolitical legacy recorded in clay, you control the future.
And that profound realization brings this entire deep dive right back home to you, the listener. It is so easy to view the ancient world as a disconnected, primitive prototype, but you live in a world built on the exact same geopolitical mechanisms established in Uruk over 4.5 millennia ago. The smartphones we use to navigate our daily lives rely entirely on supply chains of rare earth metals extracted from the modern periphery, often at a terrible human cost, just like the cedars of Lebanon.
Just like the cedars, yes.
Our global economies are still dictated by the push and pull of regional hegemonies, acting out the same zero-sum power struggles as Uruk and Kish. And our leaders, our executives, are still absolutely obsessed with managing optics, erecting monuments, and securing how history will remember them. The logistical supply chains, the heavy hand of the administrative state, and the inescapable human costs of maintaining civilization haven't fundamentally changed a single bit since Gilgamesh ordered his citizens to start baking bricks.
It leaves us with a critical framework to apply to our own era. The oldest story we possess proves that history is ultimately written by the victors, by those who control the centralized power. As we continue to build our own modern iterations of the walls of Uruk, and as we reach deeper and more aggressively into the wild periphery to fuel our endless technological and economic growth, we have to ask ourselves the same questions the epic asks. Who is the Humbaba we are displacing today to secure our resources? And when the dust settles, how will future generations translate the myth of our own consumption?